The letter arrived on a Tuesday in March of 1882, and by the following Sunday, Eleanor Marsh had sold nearly everything she owned, packed 2 trunks and a leather satchel filled with books, and boarded a westbound train from Cincinnati with her heart hammering so loudly she was certain the elderly woman seated beside her could hear it. She was 24 years old, the daughter of a Methodist minister and a schoolteacher mother who had died of fever when Eleanor was 12, and she had spent the better part of the last 3 years standing in front of a crowded classroom in Ohio, teaching the children of factory workers and coal miners their letters and their numbers, watching the seasons change through a single narrow window that looked out over a row of identical brick buildings. It was not that she was unhappy, exactly. It was more that the world felt impossibly small, and she had the persistent, aching sense that there was something waiting for her somewhere beyond those brick walls and gray skies, something she could not name but could feel tugging at her like a current beneath still water. The letter had come from a man named Josiah Pratt, who identified himself as the mayor of a town called Caldwell Crossing in the Kansas Territory, though by 1882 Kansas had been a state for over 20 years, and Caldwell Crossing had not yet caught up with the idea of itself as anything permanent. Mayor Pratt wrote in a cramped, urgent hand that the town had 43 children between the ages of 5 and 14 who had not seen the inside of a proper schoolroom in 2 years, ever since their last schoolteacher, a Mr. Elias Holt, had been lured away to a position in Dodge City that paid twice the salary. The town was prepared to offer Miss Marsh room and board at the home of widow Ruth Calloway, a modest stipend of $18 per month, and the use of a small building that had most recently served as a grain storage shed, which the men of the town had spent the past 3 weeks converting into what Mayor Pratt described in his letter as a perfectly adequate schoolhouse. Eleanor had written back within the hour of receiving the letter, accepting the position without hesitation, and then had sat at her desk in her small boarding room in Cincinnati, and felt the ground shift beneath her feet in a way that had nothing to do with the building and everything to do with the fact that she had just agreed to go somewhere she had never been, to teach children she had never met, in a town she could barely find on a map. The train journey took 4 days, with 2 transfers and a 6-hour wait in Kansas City that felt like its own small eternity, and when Eleanor finally stepped off the stagecoach that had carried her the final 30 miles from the nearest rail station to Caldwell Crossing, she stood in the middle of a wide dirt street and looked around at the collection of wooden storefronts and dust and open sky and felt, against all reasonable expectation, as though she had arrived somewhere that had been waiting for her. The town was exactly what the frontier towns of 1882 looked like, which is to say it was rough and alive and full of contradictions. There was a general store with a porch where 3 old men sat in rocking chairs regardless of the weather. There was a saloon called the Silver Spur that seemed to do the most consistent business of any establishment in town. There was a livery stable and a blacksmith and a small church and a barber shop and a telegraph office and a doctor's office that doubled as the dentist's office, because Dr. Felix Abrams had trained in both disciplines and considered the overlap reasonable. There were houses scattered along streets that were not really streets so much as paths that had been worn down by enough feet and hooves to achieve the status of intention, and beyond the houses on every side was the land itself, enormous and wind-scoured and beautiful in a way that Eleanor had not expected, and that made her breath catch in her chest the first time she really looked at it. Mayor Pratt met her at the stagecoach, a round, red-faced man in a suit that had seen better decades, and he introduced her to Ruth Calloway, who was a tall, thin woman of about 60 with silver hair, pinned severely at the back of her head and eyes that were sharp and kind in equal measure. Ruth Calloway shook Eleanor's hand with a grip that suggested she had spent a great portion of her life doing things that required actual physical strength, which Eleanor would later learn was exactly true, because Ruth had homesteaded this land with her husband George for 15 years before his heart gave out in the spring of 1878, and left her alone with 40 acres and a determination to see it through. The schoolhouse was, as Mayor Pratt had somewhat optimistically described it, perfectly adequate. The walls were sound, the roof had been newly shingled, and someone had made a genuine effort to install proper windows with glass rather than oiled paper. There was a pot-bellied stove in the corner for winter warmth, a long plank of dark wood at the front that would serve as a chalkboard once painted with the proper mixture, and rows of benches that had been built by hand and were not entirely level, but were solid enough to sit on without concern. Eleanor stood in the center of the room on her first afternoon and turned slowly in a circle, taking it all in, and thought that she could make something good here. She thought it with a certainty that surprised her. She met him for the first time on her third morning in Caldwell Crossing. She had risen early, as was her habit, and walked from Ruth Calloway's house to the schoolhouse to begin the work of arranging the space before classes were to begin the following Monday. The morning was cool and smelled of sage, and something she could not immediately identify, something clean and wide, and she was carrying a stack of primers and a box of chalk and walking with her head down, thinking about curriculum, when she rounded the corner past the livery stable and walked directly into something solid. The stack of primers went in one direction, the box of chalk went in another. Eleanor herself staggered backward, and a hand shot out and caught her by the elbow before she could sit down abruptly in the dirt, which was the direction the situation had been heading. She looked up. The man holding her elbow was tall, broader through the shoulders than most men she had encountered, with the particular kind of unhurried stillness that she would come to understand was not apathy, but rather a quality of attention so complete that he did not feel the need to fill space with movement or sound. He wore a dark hat pulled low over dark eyes, a work shirt faded by sun and washing to the color of old denim, and leather boots that told the story of a great many miles walked across hard ground. He looked to be somewhere in his early 30s, with lines at the corners of his eyes that came from squinting into sun and wind rather than from age alone, and a jaw that needed the attention of a razor but had not yet received it that morning. He looked at her with an expression that was not quite surprise and not quite recognition, but something in between, as though he had been expecting to encounter something, and she was not quite what he had imagined. "I am so sorry," Eleanor said, because she was Ohio-raised and Methodist, and apologizing was her first instinct even when the situation was equally shared. "I was not watching where I was going." He bent without a word and began collecting primers from the dirt, stacking them carefully in his large hands as though they were something fragile and worth the care. He picked up the chalk box and closed the lid on it, checked to see how many had broken, and handed everything back to her in a single, efficient motion. "No harm," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, matching the rest of him. He had a slight accent she could not place, something that lived at the southern edge of the Midwest. "I am Eleanor Marsh," she said, because it seemed like the appropriate thing to follow the retrieval of her books with. "The new schoolteacher." He nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something he had already known or suspected. "Cole Whittaker," he said. "I work the Harmon Ranch east of town." They stood looking at each other for a moment that was neither comfortable nor uncomfortable, but simply present, the way that significant moments sometimes announce themselves to the people inside them without being entirely clear about what they are announcing. "Thank you for catching my books," Eleanor said. "Thank you for the books," he said, and then seemed to realize that this was a strange thing to say and looked briefly as though he might say something else to clarify, and then seemed to decide against it, and touched the brim of his hat in the way that men in this part of the world touched their brims, and walked on toward the livery stable. And Eleanor stood in the morning sun watching him go with her stack of primers pressed against her chest, and something she could not quite account for stirring in the place between her ribs. She put it aside and went to arrange her schoolroom. The first week of school was, as Eleanor had anticipated, a form of organized chaos. 41 children arrived on Monday morning, ranging from a 5-year-old girl named Bess Turner who sat in the front row with enormous solemnity, and a slate she had clearly been practicing on at home, to a 14-year-old boy named Pete Harmon who arrived late and sat in the back, and made it clear through his posture alone that he considered himself too old for this enterprise, but had been sent by someone whose authority he was not quite prepared to challenge. Eleanor knew how to handle all of it. She had been taught by her mother, who had been taught by her own mother, that the first thing you did when you walked into a classroom was find out what each child already knew, because a child who was bored was a child who was lost, and a child who was struggling was a child who was invisible, and both were failures of attention on the part of the teacher rather than failures of intelligence on the part of the child. She moved through the room in those first days like something purposeful, sitting beside this child and that one, asking questions, listening with the whole of herself to the answers, and by the end of the first week she had a clear picture of where everyone stood and what each one needed. Pete Harmon, it turned out, was not indifferent to learning. He was embarrassed by it, which was a different thing entirely. He could read adequately but wrote with the labored effort of someone who had never been taught to hold a pen properly, and Eleanor sat beside him on Wednesday afternoon after the other children had gone home and said, simply and without ceremony, "Your letters are well formed, but your wrist is tense. Try holding the pen looser, as though you are holding a bird that you do not want to escape, but also do not want to injure." Pete had stared at her and then looked down at the pen in his hand and made a small adjustment, and the next line he wrote was measurably better, and something shifted in his face that was not quite a smile, but was the precursor to one. She was walking home from the schoolhouse that Friday afternoon, tired in the good way that comes from having done something real, when she passed the paddock behind the livery stable and saw Cole Whitaker there. He was working a horse, a young roan that was clearly not yet comfortable with the saddle, moving in slow circles around it, speaking to it in a voice she could not hear from the fence but could see the effect of in the gradual settling of the animal's ears and the easing of the tension across its back. She stopped without meaning to. There was something about the way he moved, the patience of it, the absolute refusal to impose himself on the horse's timeline, that held her attention the way that a piece of music sometimes caught her unexpectedly and made the world rearrange itself around the sound of it. He looked up and saw her at the fence. He did not appear startled or embarrassed, only looked at her steadily for a moment in that way he had, and then returned his attention to the horse, and Eleanor thought that a man who looked at a frightened animal the way he looked at it was a man who understood that trust was not demanded but grown, and she found that she agreed with this completely even though she could not have explained how she knew it about him from the outside of a paddock on a Friday afternoon. She walked home. Ruth Calloway made supper that evening that involved a beef stew so good it seemed to Eleanor like a form of argument for the frontier itself, thick with root vegetables, and seasoned with something she could not identify but would later learn was a combination of dried sage and a small amount of pepper that Ruth considered one of her more important household secrets. They sat at the kitchen table while the evening light came golden through the window, and Ruth asked about the first week of school, and Eleanor told her about Bess Turner and her practice slate and Pete Harmon and the pen and his wrist, and Ruth listened with the focused attention of someone who understood that children's stories were never only about children. "You will do well here," Ruth said, when Eleanor had finished. It was not offered as flattery but as assessment, and Eleanor received it as such. "I hope so," Eleanor said. "I feel as though I am exactly where I should be, which is a feeling I am not entirely accustomed to." Ruth looked at her with those sharp, kind eyes and said nothing for a moment, and then said, "That feeling usually means something," and poured them both more coffee, and that was that. The following week, Eleanor began the work of making the schoolhouse into something more than an adequate building. She had brought from Cincinnati a dozen books beyond the standard primers, stories and histories, and a collection of poems that her mother had given her. And she arranged these on a shelf along the back wall with a small hand-lettered sign that said Lending Library, because she believed that a book that was not being read was a book that was not fully alive, and she wanted these books alive. She had also written a letter to Cincinnati, to the school board she had left behind, requesting a donation of any surplus educational materials they might have, maps and globes and arithmetic cards, and had sent a similar letter to a publisher in St. Louis, who she had heard occasionally donated to frontier schools. She was not certain either letter would produce results, but she sent them with the conviction that asking was always the necessary first step, and that silence was the only guaranteed failure. It was on a Wednesday of that second week that Cole Whittaker appeared at the schoolhouse door. Classes had ended an hour earlier, and Eleanor was erasing the chalkboard and reviewing the next day's lesson plan when she heard the door and turned to find him standing in the frame of it, hat in his hands, looking around the room with an expression she could not immediately read. "Mr. Whittaker," she said, because she was still at the stage of things where surnames felt like the appropriate geography. "Miss Marsh," he said. He looked at the shelf of books along the back wall. "I heard there were books." She looked at him for a moment, recalibrating some assumption she had not known she was making. "There are," she said. "Are you looking for something in particular?" He was quiet for a moment, turning his hat slowly in his hands, and she recognized the gesture as the physical form of a hesitation, the way that a person who does not easily ask for things looked when they were about to ask for something. "I never had much schooling," he said. "My family moved around. There was not always a school where we were." He said it flatly, without apology or self-pity, which somehow made it more significant rather than less. "I can read some, but not well." Eleanor set down her eraser and looked at him directly and said, "Which books have you tried?" He blinked, as though he had been prepared for something more complicated than a practical question. "I have a Bible. Most of the words in it I know by sound rather than by sight." He paused. "There is a dime novel I borrowed from one of the other hands at the ranch. I can get through most of it, but there are words I skip." Eleanor crossed the room and ran her finger along the shelf until she found a thin volume she had been saving for exactly this kind of student. Not a child, but someone who had come to reading later and needed a beginning that did not feel like a beginning. She pulled it from the shelf and held it out. "Mark Twain," she said. "The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. It was published 6 years ago, and the language in it is straightforward and lively. If you encounter words you do not know, write them down and bring the list to me." He looked at the book in her hand and then at her face, as though he was checking for condescension and finding none. He took the book carefully, the same carefulness she had noticed when he had collected her primers from the dirt. "How much?" he asked. "It is a lending library," she said. "You return it when you are finished. That is the full transaction." He looked at the book again and then looked at her and said, "Thank you, Miss Marsh," with a weight to it that suggested the thanks was for something larger than the loan of a single book, and left. She stood in the empty schoolroom after he had gone and thought about a man who had worked ranches and ridden the open land for probably 15 years, and still had not surrendered the desire to read. And something in her chest did a complicated thing that she did not examine too closely, because she had 41 children's lessons to plan for the following morning, and that was where her attention needed to be. He came back on Saturday with a list. He stood at the door of the schoolhouse where Eleanor was painting the front step, which had developed a soft spot she was determined to solve with paint, and the optimism of a woman who had not grown up doing carpentry. And he held out a folded piece of paper on which 12 words were written in large, careful letters that showed both the effort they had cost and the intelligence behind them. They were not, she noticed, the easy words. They were words like melancholy and exasperated and commenced, words that a person who was reading carefully rather than skimming would stop at rather than pass over. She took the list and read through it and looked up at him and said, "You read quickly." "I have been at it most of the week," he said. "In the evenings." She talked him through each word, not just the meaning but the sound of it, the way it came apart and went back together, the places where it showed up in other forms and other contexts. He listened the way she had not often seen people listen, with an absolute stillness of the outer self and a quality of focus underneath that suggested he was collecting everything she said and storing it somewhere he could find it later. When they had gone through the full list, he said, "There are two more I did not write down because I was not sure how to spell them well enough to write them." "Say them," she said. He said the words and she found them for him and explained them, and then there was a silence between them that was easy rather than awkward, the silence of two people who have done something satisfying together and do not feel the need to fill the space afterward. "What happens when you finish the book?" she asked. "I bring it back," he said. And then, he left the question incomplete in the way that suggested he was hoping she would finish it. "And then there are other books," she said. "There are always other books." Something shifted in his expression, very slightly, barely enough to see unless you were the kind of person who paid attention to small things, and Eleanor was exactly that kind of person. It was not quite a smile, though there was warmth in it. It was more like recognition, like the sound a door makes when it finds the right key. He touched his hat and walked back down the street toward the livery, and Eleanor watched him go and then looked down at her list in her hand and noticed that his handwriting, which she had initially assessed as large and careful, was actually something more than that. The letters were formed with an almost architectural precision, each one deliberate, none of them rushed, and the whole thing had a quality about it that suggested a person who, given the proper instruction at the proper time, might have done remarkable things in rooms full of books and chalkboards. It was not the last time she thought this. The spring settled over Caldwell Crossing like a slow, warm hand, and Eleanor fell into the rhythms of a life that surprised her with how fully it fit. She rose early and walked to the schoolhouse and taught through the morning and afternoon, and in the evenings she sat at Ruth Calloway's kitchen table and planned lessons by lamplight. And on Saturdays, she went to the general store and the post office and sometimes, increasingly, to the schoolhouse, where Cole Whittaker had taken to coming in the late afternoons with a book and his list. It had become a practice without either of them formally agreeing to make it one. He would arrive perhaps 3 times a week, sometimes with a list of words and sometimes with a question about a passage that confused him, and sometimes with a piece of paper on which he had written a sentence of his own, shy of it in the way that beginning writers are always shy of their own words, looking at her sidelong when he handed it over as though he was not entirely certain. He wanted her to read it, but had brought it anyway because there was a part of him that needed her too. His sentences were spare and concrete, as a person would expect from someone who had spent his life in the physical world, but they had a quality to them that Eleanor recognized from a certain kind of writer, the kind who saw precisely and said only what they saw without decoration, and in that precision arrived at something that decoration would have ruined. "You write well," she told him one April afternoon, when he had handed her a paragraph about watching a storm come across the prairie from the door of the ranch bunkhouse, the way the light changed before it, the way the horses felt it before the humans did. He looked at the paper in her hand with the skepticism of someone who assumed the compliment was politeness rather than assessment. "It is just what happened," he said. "The best writing usually is," she said. "The skill is in knowing what to include and what to leave out. You have that instinct already." He was quiet for a moment. Outside the schoolhouse window, 2 of her students were chasing each other across the empty yard in the late afternoon sun, their voices bright and careless. He watched them for a moment and then looked back at her. "I am sorry I did not learn this earlier," he said. "I wasted a lot of years." "You did not waste them," she said firmly, because she believed this completely. "You were learning other things, things that a classroom would not have taught you. You can feel a storm before it comes, and you can read a horse's mood, and you know how to move slowly through the world in a way that makes space for other things to trust you. Those are not small things to know." He looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that covered a great deal of ground between 2 people, and said quietly, "You pay attention." "It is a prerequisite of my profession," she said, and he almost smiled, and that almost smile had by this point come to be one of her preferred things about a day. May arrived, and with it three things: a letter from the St. Louis publisher containing a package of maps and a small globe that Eleanor immediately placed at the center of the classroom, and watched with satisfaction as 41 children gathered around it with the particular wonder of people encountering the shape of the world for the first time in something they could touch. A dust storm that descended on Caldwell Crossing for 2 days and turned the air brown and taught Eleanor that a wet cloth held over the nose and mouth was non-negotiable and not a suggestion, and a complication. The complication arrived in the form of a man named Gerald Whitfield, who was perhaps 35, the son of one of the town's founding families, and who had a handsome face and a confident manner and the local reputation, Eleanor gathered from Ruth's carefully worded comments, of a man who considered himself something of a prize and expected the women of his acquaintance to agree with this assessment. Gerald Whitfield began appearing at the schoolhouse at the end of school days with an air of courtly attention that Eleanor recognized, and was not entirely sure how to address without being unkind to a man who had, as far as she could observe, done nothing specifically wrong beyond assuming his own appeal with more conviction than the evidence supported. He brought flowers on 2 occasions, wild flowers gathered from the prairie's edge, which were beautiful enough that refusing them would have been churlish, and he asked if he could escort her to the church social that was planned for the 3rd Saturday of May, which was a perfectly reasonable thing to ask. Eleanor went to the church social with Gerald Whitfield because he had asked politely, and because she was new to the town and the social was a community event, and it seemed both ungracious and isolating to refuse, and she danced 2 dances with him and ate cold chicken and talked to the families of her students and felt, the entire time, pleasantly occupied but essentially unmoved. She noticed, during the social, that Cole Whitaker was there, standing at the edge of things in the way that he moved through most group situations, present but not consuming the room's attention, which Eleanor was beginning to understand was not shyness exactly, but a preference for the periphery that had more to do with observation than avoidance. He was talking to one of the older ranchers about something, but she saw his eyes move across the room once and find her and then move away, and she felt the awareness of that glance in a way that was disproportionate to its duration. Gerald Whitfield said, on the walk home from the social, that he hoped she was settling in comfortably and that Caldwell Crossing was lucky to have her, and that he would very much like to call on her again if she had no objection. Eleanor said, as kindly as she could and as clearly as the situation required, that she was settling in very well and that she appreciated his kindness, but that she had come to Caldwell Crossing for her work, and that her work consumed most of her attention, and that she did not wish to give him a false impression of her availability for courtship. She said this looking him directly in the face, which was the only honest way to say it, and he received it with a grace that went up in her estimation of him, nodding once and saying that he understood, and that the offer stood should her circumstances change, and then walking away without drama. Eleanor went to bed that night and stared at the ceiling of her room at Ruth Calloway's house, and thought about the fact that she had found it necessary to say she was unavailable for courtship, while simultaneously being aware that the reason she had found it necessary was that she had developed a very specific interest in a quiet man who came to her schoolhouse 3 times a week with a list of words and a paragraph about storms. She put this thought away in the same way that she had been putting it away for weeks, which was to say she placed it carefully in a part of her mind that was labeled "not yet," and returned her attention to the 41 children who were counting on her to show up fully the following morning. June came in hot and alive. The prairie grass was tall and the cattle were fat on it, and there was a general mood in Caldwell Crossing of something working the way it was supposed to, which was rare enough in a frontier town of 1882 that the residents of Caldwell Crossing seemed aware of it, and grateful for it in the way that people are grateful for good weather in a country where weather is not reliably good. Cole Whitaker had, by this point, finished 4 books. Tom Sawyer, followed by a collection of short stories by Washington Irving, which he had found strange and vivid, and had asked Eleanor extensive questions about, and then a history of the American West written by an Eastern journalist in 1878, which he had regarded with a mixture of recognition and irritation at the parts that got things wrong, saying once with a precision that made Eleanor want to laugh. He has clearly never spent a night on the open range, or he would not describe it as romantic. It is cold, and the coyotes are loud and your back hurts. And then a collection of poems by Walt Whitman, which Eleanor had offered half as an experiment and half as a gift, and which had produced a silence in Cole Whitaker that was different from his usual silences, deeper and less comfortable, as though something in it had reached through the careful reserve of him and touched something he was not in the habit of having touched. He had said nothing about the Whitman for 2 weeks, and then had arrived one Tuesday afternoon with a single poem copied out in his precise, architectural handwriting onto a piece of paper folded in thirds, and placed it on her desk without comment while she was working with a group of younger children at the back of the room, and was gone before she saw it. The poem he had chosen was Song of the Open Road, and he had underlined a single stanza in pencil, so faintly it was almost not there, the one that began with the word afoot and contains the idea that the road itself is a companion, that forward movement through the open world is itself a form of belonging. Eleanor sat with that piece of paper for a long time after the children had gone home. The following Thursday she handed him back the paper with a single line written beneath the underlined stanza, from a different poem by the same author, a line about the earth being not just a thing to be crossed, but a thing that holds you, that keeps you. And she watched him read it and saw the line of his jaw soften in a way that had become one of her references for whether a thing was true or not. This was the geography of them that summer, conducted almost entirely in books and borrowed words, and the particular language of 2 people who have discovered that they think in compatible registers, and are finding it extraordinary. It was Ruth Calloway who said something about it first, because Ruth Calloway did not believe in the kind of polite dishonesty that allowed obvious things to remain unexamined. It was a July evening, warm and thick, and Eleanor was sitting on the porch reading, and Ruth came out with 2 glasses of cold water drawn from the well and sat in the other chair and said, without preamble, "Cole Whitaker is a good man." Eleanor looked up from her book and said, "Yes, I believe he is. He has had a hard life," Ruth said. "He came to this area about 4 years ago from down south, Texas first and then Missouri, and before that I do not think he had much of what most people would call a home. He works hard and he drinks little and he minds his business." She paused. "He is at your schoolhouse a great deal for a man who has no children." Eleanor looked at the prairie beyond Ruth's fence, where the evening light was making long gold shapes across the grass, and said, "He is learning to read." "Is that what it is?" Ruth said, not as a question. Eleanor was quiet for a moment and then said, with more honesty than she had intended, "It is also other things." Ruth nodded slowly, sipping her water. "Other things tend to happen," she said, "when 2 particular kinds of people are in the same room enough times." She did not say anything else about it, which was the most effective thing she could have done. Eleanor lay awake that night listening to the prairie sounds, the insects and the distant cry of something she could not identify from inside a house in Ohio, but had come to recognize as a particular species of owl, and thought about Cole Whitaker in the clear-eyed way that she had been avoiding, because she had come to Caldwell Crossing to teach children, and not to become entangled with a quiet cowboy who collected words and underlined poetry. And yet here she was, entirely entangled. And the question was not whether she was, but what she intended to do about it. She did not reach a conclusion that night, but she decided that at the very least she would stop pretending to herself that she had not. The summer went on in the way of frontier summers, relentlessly, beautifully, with a heat that was not like Ohio heat but was drier and somehow more honest about itself. And the children of Caldwell Crossing came to the schoolhouse 5 mornings a week, and Eleanor taught them with everything she had. And in the late afternoons Cole Whitaker came and they talked about books. Or rather she talked, and he listened with that total attention of his, and then said things that were carefully chosen and usually more penetrating than anything she could have planned. He had begun writing more. Full pages now, not just paragraphs, descriptions of the land and of the work and of things he had seen in his years moving through the Western territories, and he showed them to her with the same combination of reluctance and need that had characterized the early single sentences. And she read them all and told him what she thought with the same directness she brought to everything, because she had found that he did not want to be managed. He wanted to be met. One afternoon in late July, he arrived with a page that was different from the others. She could see it before she read it, something in the way he set it on her desk, less reluctance and more a kind of held breath, as though he had made a decision and the paper was the evidence of it. She read it, and the words were about a woman who moved through a room the way that morning light moved through a gap in clouds, purposeful and unrepeatable, and a man who had spent his life in open spaces learning to notice the way that the landscape changed from hour to hour, and who had found that watching this woman think was the most interesting landscape he had encountered. Eleanor sat with this for a moment and then looked up at him, where he was standing by the window with his hat in his hands in that gesture she had come to know, and said, "Cole." He looked at her. "Are you writing about me?" she asked, because she needed to hear him say it. He was quiet for a long moment, the honest kind of quiet that is not evasion but consideration. "Yes," he said. She got up from her desk and stood in front of him and said, "I need to tell you something, and I need to say it plainly because I do not know how else to be." He waited, and she saw in his face the slight bracing that a person does when they expect to hear something that will not be what they hoped, and it made something ache in her chest in a useful way, because it meant that he was hoping. "I came here for the children," she said. "I came because I believe that education is the single most important thing I could give to anyone, and I believe that as completely now as I did in March. But something has happened here that I was not expecting, and I am not sure I have the words for it except to say that the hours I spend in this room with you are the hours I look forward to most in my week. And when I read anything now, I hear your voice saying what you would say about it, and that seems to me to be significant enough to not ignore." Cole Whitaker looked at her with those dark eyes that she had spent months learning to read and said, "I have been learning from you since the first morning I saw you walking down the street with your arms full of primers. You caught my books," she said. "I would catch everything you dropped," he said, "for the rest of my life if you would let me." It was not a declaration from a dime novel. It was exactly what it was, a man who had spent his whole life in the concrete world saying a concrete thing, and it was the most eloquent thing Eleanor Marsh had ever heard. She reached out and put her hand over his where he held his hat, and his hand was still for a moment, and then turned under hers and held on, and they stood in the late afternoon light of the schoolhouse she had made from a grain shed, surrounded by 41 children's drawings and a shelf of living books, and looked at each other with the clear-eyed recognition of two people who had arrived at something real. He leaned down and kissed her, once, gently, with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, and she kissed him back with the same directness that was her nature, and then they stood together in the space between what had been building all summer and what came next, and it was the best place Eleanor Marsh had ever stood in her life. August arrived, and the town of Caldwell Crossing began to understand what was happening between the schoolteacher and the ranch hand, because small towns in 1882 were not places where things of this nature remained private for very long. There were knowing looks exchanged at the general store, and a certain warmth in the way that Eleanor's neighbors greeted Cole when they saw him walking alongside her on the main street. And Ruth Calloway said nothing at all except to set 3 plates at supper one Sunday evening, when Cole had been invited, a gesture of inclusion so matter-of-fact that it was more meaningful than any formal announcement could have been. Cole was different in her presence now, not dramatically different. He was not a man given to dramatic transformation, but something had settled in him, a quality of ease that she had not seen when they first met, as though a thing that had been held at careful distance had been allowed to come home. He still came to the schoolhouse 3 times a week, but now sometimes he stayed for supper at Ruth's afterward, and sometimes on Sunday mornings he walked with Eleanor to church and sat beside her in the pew with his hat on his knee and his attention on the minister, though she noticed that afterward he often had things to say about the sermon that were more interesting than the sermon itself. He had by this point read 8 books and was in the middle of his 9th, a thick volume of American history that Eleanor had ordered from a bookseller in Kansas City, and he read with the focused intensity of someone making up for lost time without resentment, as though each book was not a reminder of what he had missed, but a door he had not known to look for and was glad to find. He had also begun keeping a journal. She knew this because he told her, not showing her the journal itself, which she understood was private in the way that certain things need to be private to remain honest, but telling her that he was writing in it every evening, that he had begun to understand that writing was a way of thinking more completely than he had previously managed, that there were things in the journal that he had not been able to articulate even to himself before he wrote them down. "That is what writing does," she said. "It is not recording thoughts, it is having them." He looked at her with that expression she had come to love, the one that was not quite a smile but was everything that a smile meant, and said, "You could have been a philosopher." "I am a schoolteacher," she said. "The difference is smaller than most philosophers would like to admit." He laughed, actually laughed, a rare sound from him that she valued with the exactness that rare things deserve, and she thought that she would spend a very long time trying to make that sound happen as often as possible. September brought the anniversary of Eleanor's arrival, which she had not planned to observe, but which felt significant in the way that the first turning of a year in a new place always feels significant. The children were back in school after a short summer break, and the class had grown by 3 students whose families had arrived in the area over the summer. A family of German immigrants named Berger who had 2 boys and a girl, and who spoke excellent English through effort and determination, and who became, almost immediately, 3 of Eleanor's most engaged students, perhaps because they understood better than most the direct line between literacy and belonging. She had written to Cincinnati 3 times over the course of the summer, once to a former colleague about educational methods, once to a bookseller about an order of arithmetic primers, and once to her father, who wrote back in his careful minister's hand to say that he was glad she was well, and that he had not doubted she would find her place, which was not true. She knew he had doubted it considerably, but she received the words in the spirit in which they were intended. She also wrote a letter to the Kansas State Board of Education in Topeka, describing the conditions of the Caldwell Crossing School and requesting formal recognition and additional funding, because the school was operating on the town's budget alone, and there were things the children needed: a second proper chalkboard, more primers, a better collection of arithmetic materials that the town could not entirely provide. The letter was 3 pages, carefully argued, and she sent it with the same conviction she had applied to every other piece of correspondence she had sent into the institutional world, which was that you asked clearly, backed by evidence, and then you waited with patience but not with doubt. The letter from the State Board arrived 6 weeks later with a response that was encouraging if not immediately generous, acknowledging the school's existence, commending its growth, and indicating that a formal grant of $40 would be made available in the spring, provided that the school met certain enrollment and attendance requirements, which Eleanor immediately identified as requirements that the school was already meeting and would continue to meet without difficulty. She read the letter at breakfast and put it on the table with a flat-palmed satisfaction that Ruth Calloway observed and smiled at. Cole came that evening, as he did most evenings now, and sat across the kitchen table from her while Ruth sat with her sewing by the fire, and Eleanor told him about the letter and he listened and said, "You wrote to the state government." "I did," she said, "and they responded." "They did." He was quiet for a moment and then said, "When I came to this country, the idea that a letter from one person could change how a thing was funded would not have seemed possible to me. Most things that are possible do not seem possible until someone tries them," she said. He looked at her with that look and said, "You have made me believe more things are possible than I used to." She reached across the table and touched his hand and said, "You have made me believe the same things about myself, in return." This was true, in ways she had been thinking about for weeks. He had shown her, through the particular quality of his attention, that her ideas about teaching, about learning, about the way that knowledge moved between people, were not simply things she had been trained to believe, but things that she actually understood in a way that went deeper than training. He paid attention to her as though what she said and thought had weight and consequence, and she had not, until he began doing it, understood how rarely she had been paid that particular kind of attention in her life. October in Caldwell Crossing was the most beautiful thing Eleanor had seen since arriving. The grass went gold and the sky went the particular sharp blue of a cold, clear day, and the cottonwood trees along the creek southeast of town turned yellow, and the whole landscape had a quality to it that she struggled to describe in the letter she wrote to her father about it, settling finally on the word enormous, which was insufficient but was the nearest single word she had. Cole took her riding one Sunday afternoon in October. She had ridden before in Ohio with her uncle on a farm visits, but not well and not confidently, and she told him this honestly before they set out, and he said, as she had known he would, "We will go slowly," and they did, walking the horses through the tall grass south of town along the creek, and he talked to her the way he talked to horses, with a quiet, continuous, unhurried attention that was both practical and somehow tender. She asked him, as they rode, about his years before Caldwell Crossing, because there were things about his history she knew only in outline, and she wanted to understand the shape of him more fully. He talked, more than she had heard him talk in a sustained way, about growing up in Arkansas with a father who moved from place to place following work that never quite materialized into stability, about leaving at 16 to work cattle drives north through Texas and Oklahoma, before the trail drives began their long decline against the coming of the railroad, about years of ranch work in New Mexico and Colorado, and eventually Kansas. The kind of life that moved constantly through the physical world and gave a man an education in the land and the animals and the weather and very little else. "Were you ever tempted to stop?" she asked, "to find a place and stay?" "Yes," he said. "Once or twice. But I did not know what I was looking for, and when you do not know what you are looking for, it is easy to keep moving, because at least then you have the sense of searching, even if you are not sure for what." She looked at him riding beside her in the October light and said, "And now?" He looked ahead at the yellow trees and the golden grass and the enormous blue sky, and then looked at her and said, "Now I know." She looked back at him steadily and felt something complete in her chest, the way that a sentence completes when the final word arrives and the whole meaning of it becomes clear. They rode back to town in the companionable silence of people who have said what needs to be said and do not need to continue saying it. He asked her to marry him in November. He did it in the schoolhouse, on a Thursday afternoon after classes, because the schoolhouse was where they had found each other, and he considered it the appropriate location for the question. He did not have a ring. He told her frankly that he did not have one yet but would get one from the jeweler in Dodge City if she said yes, and he asked her in a single direct sentence in the voice he used for important things, the same voice he had when he explained something precisely to a horse, or said something that needed to be heard without elaboration. "Eleanor Marsh," he said, "I want to spend my life learning from you and with you, and I want to build something in this place that we can both belong to. Will you marry me?" Eleanor stood before him in the room where she had taught him to hold words like the things they were, mirrors and windows and maps, and she said, "Yes. Of course I will." He did get the ring, a simple band with a small garnet that caught the light in a way that seemed disproportionate to its size, and he brought it back from Dodge City on a Saturday and put it on her finger in Ruth Calloway's kitchen, while Ruth watched with the expression of someone watching a thing they had seen coming for a long time and were glad to see arrive. They were married in January of 1883 in the small church of Caldwell Crossing, on a Saturday morning when the sky was the color of pale pewter, and the ground was hard with cold, and the breath of the congregation made small clouds in the air inside the church, because the stove had not yet brought the room to proper warmth. The minister was a tall, earnest man named Pastor Owen, who had come to Kansas from Georgia, and had a voice that carried without effort through any space it entered. 41 children were in the pews alongside their parents, which was not customary but which Eleanor had not discouraged, and they sat with the particular good behavior of children who understood that something important was happening and wanted to be part of it. Ruth Calloway sat in the front pew and did not cry, but she held a folded handkerchief in her hand throughout the ceremony, which amounted to the same thing. Cole stood at the front of the church in a dark coat she had not seen before, newly purchased and brushed, and he looked at her when she came down the aisle with his usual quality of complete attention, and she thought that being looked at by him with that attention was something she would never stop being grateful for. She had written her own vows, which was not the tradition but which Pastor Owen had permitted with the good sense of a man who understood when a person had something specific to say and should be allowed to say it. She said that she had come to Caldwell Crossing to give something, and had found instead that she was receiving something she had not known to look for, that she had learned from him things about patience and attention, and the dignity of a life lived honestly in the physical world, and that she intended to spend the rest of her life as both his teacher and his student, because she believed that was the only way that love worked correctly. Cole had not written his vows, and she had not expected him to, because he was not, as she understood him completely by now, a person whose most important things emerged in prepared language. He looked at her when it was his turn and said, in the quiet, certain voice that she knew meant he was speaking from the center of himself, "I spent 20 years moving across this land looking for something I could not name. You gave me the words for it. You are what I was looking for, and I will not stop moving toward you for as long as I live." There was a sound in the church that was partly the congregation and partly just the weight of the moment finding its level, and Eleanor Marsh, who was about to become Eleanor Whittaker, felt the world settle around her in the way that it only settles when you are exactly where you belong. They moved into a house in February. It was not a large house, 2 rooms and a kitchen and a sleeping loft, built on the eastern edge of Caldwell Crossing on a piece of land that Cole had leased from the Harmon Ranch owner, with the intention of purchasing it outright when he had saved the amount required. He had put aside money steadily for years, which was one of the things she had learned about him, that he was careful with what he earned in the way of a man who had spent his life with very little and had developed the habit of making things last. They built it together, not entirely from scratch. The shell had been standing as a storage building on the property, but the interior was theirs, every decision about where the shelves would go and how the kitchen would be arranged, and where the window would face made in conversation between 2 people who had strong opinions and the ability to reach agreements without casualties. The shelf that ran along the entire west wall of the main room was, by universal agreement, the books. By this point Eleanor had accumulated, through purchases and donations and the occasional windfall of a box of volumes from a closed school in Dodge City, a collection of over 60 books, and Cole had begun adding to it himself, bringing volumes from occasional trips to the city, choosing them with a care that showed the difference between a man who had learned to read and a man who had learned to love reading. He was, by the spring of 1883, writing in his journal every evening without fail. He had filled 2 journals by this point and was well into his 3rd, and Eleanor did not read them, because she understood that the privacy of those pages was part of what made them useful to him. But sometimes in the evening he would read her a passage, offering it with the same slight vulnerability he had shown when he handed her that first paragraph about storms, and she received each one with the same complete attention that he gave to everything she said. Because that was the language they had established between themselves, and she intended to keep speaking it. The school year ended in May, and Eleanor spent the summer planning the next year's curriculum, corresponding with a teachers' organization in Topeka that she had joined by mail, and attending to the matter of the garden she was attempting to establish behind their house, which was going better than expected given that she had never gardened in her life and was relying heavily on Ruth Calloway's advice and a small, practical book on prairie gardening she had found in a second-hand collection. Cole continued his work at the Harmon Ranch through the spring and summer, because the lease on their land was not yet purchased and they needed his wages alongside her stipend. But there was a shift in his trajectory that both of them were aware of without yet having fully discussed. He had been talking to Mr. Harmon about eventually managing a section of the ranch, a step up from general ranch hand that would mean more responsibility and better pay, and eventually the kind of stability that made a future look like a solid thing rather than a possibility. In July, Eleanor realized she was expecting. She told Cole on a Tuesday evening while they were sitting on the porch after supper watching the summer dark come in from the east, and he was quiet for a long moment of the particular quality that she had learned to recognize as the most serious kind, the kind that meant he was holding something large and needed a moment to understand its shape. Then he said, "Are you well?" "Yes," she said, "quite well." He put his arm around her and she leaned into him and they sat together in the summer dark, and she felt him breathe steadily. And then he said, against her hair, "I did not know it was possible to want something this much." She understood that he meant more than one thing by that, and she loved him for the multiplicity of it. She taught through October, by which point the nature of things was evident to the parents of Caldwell Crossing's children, and there were some discussions, conducted in the way of such things in 1882, about whether a woman in her condition should be standing at the front of a schoolroom. Eleanor addressed this concern at a town meeting with the same directness she brought to all challenges, saying that she was teaching arithmetic and grammar and history, and that none of these subjects required a physical condition that she did not currently possess, and that her students' education would be best served by consistency. And she taught through November and through the first weeks of December, when the weather closed in hard and school was paused for the winter break that was customary in the district. Their son was born in January of 1884, on a cold Tuesday morning with a wind from the north that rattled the window glass and Dr. Abrams present alongside Ruth Calloway, who had attended more births than she could accurately count, and whose calm was, in Eleanor's view, the most valuable thing in the room. Cole paced the length of the main room for 3 hours, which Eleanor knew because she could hear his boots on the floorboards through the wall, and when Dr. Abrams came out to him and said that he had a son, and that Eleanor was doing well, the sound Cole made was not a word, but it was the most articulate thing Eleanor had ever heard from anywhere beyond a wall. They named him George, for Ruth Calloway's late husband, because it seemed like the right debt to pay, and because Ruth, when she heard it, pressed her lips together and looked at the ceiling, and said nothing for a moment, and then said, in a voice that was steadier than her face suggested it should be, that George was a good name for a person who intended to amount to something. George Whittaker was a serious baby with dark eyes that had, according to everyone who looked at him, his father's quality of attention from the first week of his life, as though he was already assessing the world and forming conclusions. He was also, when pleased, capable of a grin of such pure delight that Eleanor sometimes stopped whatever she was doing simply to look at it. Eleanor returned to teaching in March, when George was 2 months old and Ruth Calloway had agreed, with a warmth disguised as practicality, to watch him during school hours. She carried him to Ruth's house each morning and collected him each afternoon, and occasionally, on days when Ruth had her own business to attend to, she brought him to the schoolhouse in a basket, where the children regarded him with the mixed fascination and proprietary pride of people who feel themselves connected to a thing by proximity and affection. The spring of 1884 brought the state grant that Eleanor had applied for a year and a half earlier, finally processed and delivered in the form of a bank draft for $40 that allowed her to purchase a second proper chalkboard, new primers for the lower grades, a full set of arithmetic cards, and a wall map of the United States that she hung at the front of the classroom, and that immediately became the most consulted object in the room. The children spent recesses tracing the lines of states with their fingers, locating their own town on the great flat expanse of Kansas, and arguing with a pleasant intensity about which states they intended to visit when they were grown. Pete Harmon, who was now 16 and technically beyond the age of the school's mandate, but who had continued attending, because Eleanor had suggested that it might be in his interest to do so, and he had learned that her suggestions were worth taking seriously, had developed, under Eleanor's guidance, into a writer of considerable ability. He brought her essays now, long-considered pieces about the ranch and the land and about history, and she read them and corrected them, and told him consistently that he had something to say and the skill to say it, and suggested that he consider writing letters to the Dodge City newspaper about life on the frontier, which he did, and 2 of which were published in the spring of 1884, causing such a sensation in Caldwell Crossing that Pete had to spend several days accepting the congratulations of people he had known his whole life, as though they were meeting him for the first time. Cole came to the schoolhouse one afternoon in May and sat in one of the students' benches because the children were gone and Eleanor was grading papers and he wanted to be in the room, and he watched her work for a while and then said, Pete's second piece in the paper was better than his first. Yes, she agreed, without looking up from the papers. The paragraph about the summer drives had a specific quality, Cole said, something I could feel. He has learned to be concrete, Eleanor said. It took him some time, but once he understood it, it became natural. Some people have it from the beginning. You had it from the beginning. Cole was quiet for a moment in the easy way he was quiet now and then said, I have been thinking about something. She looked up. Mr. Harmon has offered me the management position, he said. I have been considering it seriously. The pay would allow us to begin the purchase of the land in the fall, and within 3 years we would own it outright. That is wonderful, she said. There is also something else, he said. He reached into his coat and put a folded sheaf of papers on the desk nearest to him. I have been writing something that is not a journal entry and is not a letter. It is a longer piece. About the cattle drive years and the people on them and what the land looked like then as compared to now. I do not know what to do with it. She got up from her desk and sat in the bench beside him and picked up the papers and read the first page and then the second and looked up at him and said, with the complete assurance that she reserved for things she was absolutely certain of, This is a book, Cole. He looked at her steadily. That is a large word. It is the right word, she said. You have been writing a book, whether you intended to or not. The journal has been preparation. She looked at the pages in her hands. This has the quality of something that should be read by people who were not there and need to understand what it was like. He was quiet with this for a long moment. I am not an educated man, he said. Not in the formal sense. Formal sense, she repeated, and there was a gentle precision in the way she said it. You have read more books in 2 years than most formally educated men read in 5, and you have written more honestly than most of them write in a lifetime. Education is not a building you either have or do not have. It is something that grows in you, She handed the pages back to him. "Write the rest of it." He took the pages from her with both hands, the way he took everything she gave him, and looked at them and then at her and said, "I will." The summer of 1884 was when Caldwell Crossing began to feel, to Eleanor, less like a place she had arrived at and more like a place she had made. There were small things, the way she was greeted by name by every person she passed on the main street, the way that the parents of her students had come to seek her out for conversations not only about their children's progress, but about other things, concerns about the town, questions about books they had heard of, occasional and tentative expressions of opinions they had not previously felt they had the standing to voice. And Eleanor received each of these things with a warmth that was entirely genuine, because she understood that being known was a form of trust, and trust was the thing she valued most in the world. She had 47 students by the fall of 1884, because 3 new families had homesteaded in the surrounding land over the summer, and she applied for and received, after 3 letters to the state board, the funding to hire a second teacher for the lower grades, a young woman named Clara Simmons who had trained in Topeka and arrived in September with the bright, slightly overwhelmed energy of a person taking on something larger than they had expected and possessing exactly the qualities needed to manage it. Eleanor mentored Clara with the same directness that characterized everything she did, not softening the difficulties of the work, but explaining them clearly and showing by example that they were manageable. And Clara bloomed under this approach in the way that good teachers bloomed when someone paid attention to them, the way they paid attention to their students. George Whittaker, approaching his first birthday in January, had learned to pull himself upright against the furniture and to say 3 words with conviction, "Mama," and more, and inexplicably, "hat," which was a word he had attached to any circular object that came within his sight line, and which delighted his father in a way that the word "mama," for all its appropriate correctness, somehow did not quite match. Cole accepted the management position at the Harmon Ranch, and with the increase in pay, they began the process of purchasing their land. The paperwork was completed at the land office in Dodge City on a Wednesday in October, and they drove back from Dodge City in the wagon as the evening came on, George asleep across Eleanor's lap wrapped in a blanket, and the prairie dark and enormous around them. And Cole drove the horses with one hand and put his other arm around her, and she leaned against him and thought about 43 letters in the alphabet and 43 children who had never had a proper classroom, and 1 letter from a mayor with cramped, urgent handwriting, and the way that a life arranged itself, not as you planned it, but as it needed to be if you paid the right kind of attention. "What are you thinking?" He asked her in the way he had begun to ask because he had learned that her silences were usually full of something worth hearing. "I am thinking about the letter Mayor Pratt sent me," she said, "about how different everything would be if I had not answered it." He looked out at the road ahead of them for a moment and then said, "I think you would have answered any letter that led you somewhere you could teach." "Yes," she said, "but this one led here." "Yes," he agreed, "it did." The winter of 1884 into 1885 was the hardest the territory had seen in several years. There were weeks of deep cold and heavy snow that kept the school closed for 2 weeks in February, and Cole managed the ranch through conditions that required constant attention and long hours. And there were nights he came home after dark with frost in his beard and hands so cold he held them over the stove before he could do anything else. Eleanor had supper ready without fail and sat across the table from him while he ate, and they talked, as they always talked, about the day and the books and the school and the land. And the talking was part of the warmth. She had understood this for a long time, that the ongoing conversation of 2 people who found each other interesting was its own form of heat. He finished the manuscript in March of 1885. It was 40,000 words, written in 4 journals and transferred with Eleanor's help into a clean copy on proper paper, a process that took 3 weeks of evenings at the kitchen table. and during which Eleanor made only light editorial interventions on matters of spelling and punctuation, while keeping the language exactly as he had written it because it was his language, and its particular quality was the point. She wrote a letter to a publisher in St. Louis, the same publisher who had sent maps to the schoolhouse 3 years earlier, and enclosed the first 30 pages of the manuscript and a careful description of what the work was and why it mattered. She was not certain anything would come of it. She sent it because it was the right thing to do and because she had never been deterred by the possibility that something would not work. The publisher's response came in May, and it was not an acceptance, but it was not a rejection. It was a request for the full manuscript and an invitation for further correspondence. And Eleanor read this letter aloud to Cole at the kitchen table while George played with a wooden horse on the floor between them, and the spring evening came through the open window smelling of new grass and warm earth. Cole listened to the letter and was quiet for a moment and then said, "They want to read it." "They do," she said. He looked at her with something in his face that was not the restrained, almost smile she knew so well, but something less guarded than that, something that was closer to the full warmth underneath that she had always known was there, and that she received now like she received all the light that came through the windows of the house they had built together. "You did that," he said. "We did that," she corrected. "You wrote it. I sent a letter. Those are approximately equal contributions." He laughed, the real laugh, the rare one, and she thought exactly what she always thought when she heard it. They sent the full manuscript in June. The summer of 1885 was long and golden, the kind of summer that retrospectively becomes the center of a memory, warm and full and unhurried. George was a year and a half and had graduated from the furniture-assisted standing to an independent walking that was more accurately described as enthusiastic lurching, and he accompanied his father around the property on weekend mornings with the absolute conviction that he was helping, carrying small sticks and rocks from one location to another, and presenting them to Cole with the seriousness of a person delivering something essential. Cole had taken to reading aloud in the evenings. It had started with George, who responded to the sound of his father's voice with a focus that Eleanor found both touching and characteristic, and it had expanded into a general practice, the three of them in the main room after supper, George eventually falling asleep on the floor and being carried up to the loft, and Cole reading, his voice working through the pages of whatever book they were currently sharing in a way that had become one of Eleanor's most reliable happinesses. He had come a long distance from the man who had stood in her schoolhouse door, with a list of 12 words he had been too uncertain to say aloud. He read now with confidence and ease, pausing naturally for the sense of what he read, responding to it internally in ways that occasionally surfaced as comments between pages that were worth stopping for. He had also, in the course of 2 years of concentrated reading, encountered enough that he had opinions about what was well done and what was not, and his opinions were interesting because they were grounded not in the conventions of literary criticism, but in a direct sense of whether a thing was true to the experience it described, or whether the writer was performing knowledge they did not actually have. In August, Eleanor confirmed that she was expecting again, and this time the response from Cole was immediately and thoroughly overjoyed, which was different from the first time, not that he had not been glad then, but he had been careful with it then, holding it the way you held something new and fragile, whereas now he held it the way you held something precious and already proven. The publisher sent a response in September. It was an offer. It was not a large advance. The publisher was careful to explain, because the market for Western frontier narratives was uncertain, but it was a genuine offer of publication, with a proposed publication date in the spring of 1886 and a request that Mr. Whittaker consider providing an author portrait for the frontispiece. Eleanor read the letter twice and then a third time and then looked up at Cole and said nothing for a moment because she needed the moment. "They are going to publish it," she said. Cole sat with this in his hands metaphorically for a long, contained moment. Then he looked at her and said, You believed this would happen. I knew it was possible, she said, which is not quite the same thing but close enough. You always know when something is possible, he said, with the quality of a man offering an observation that is also a form of thanks for something larger than the observation itself. They wrote back to the publisher that evening, accepting the offer. The author portrait was taken in November by a photographer who came through Dodge City and who Cole visited on a Thursday, returning with a small card photograph of himself that Eleanor looked at for a long time. This quiet man who had arrived in her life carrying her fallen books, looking directly at the camera with the same dark, serious, attentive eyes that had been looking at her across schoolrooms and kitchen tables for 3 years. She put the photograph on the shelf beside the books. Their daughter arrived in February of 1886, 2 weeks before the book was due to be printed, and 3 weeks before it was distributed to booksellers in Kansas City and St. Louis, and a handful of other western cities. They named her Clara Me Whittaker, the Clara for the younger teacher at the school and the Me for Eleanor's mother, whose full name had been Mary Eleanor Marsh, and who had been called Me by everyone who knew her well and had died at 40 of a fever, and had given her daughter a love of books and a directness of spirit, and the belief that a life spent in a classroom was a life well spent. Clara Me was born with her father's stillness and her mother's directness, which was an unusual combination in an infant but which asserted itself immediately, because she looked at everything around her with an attention that caused Dr. Abrams, who had been called for the birth as he had been called for George's, to say that she had the oldest eyes he had seen on a new baby in his career, and Cole held her in his large, careful hands with the same quality of patience he had always brought to new and fragile things, and she looked up at him and appeared to be satisfied by what she found. George regarded his sister with the initial suspicion of a 25-month-old encountering competition for parental attention, which resolved within 2 weeks into a proprietary protectiveness that would, Eleanor predicted with confidence, define the relationship between them for the rest of their lives. The book arrived from St. Louis in a crate of 12 copies in March of 1886, and Cole opened the crate at the kitchen table, while Eleanor stood beside him with Clara Me in her arms and George pressed against his father's side, trying to see over the top of the crate. And when Cole lifted the first copy out and held it in his hands, Eleanor watched his face for the expression she was looking for and found it. It was the same expression he had worn the first time he had read a sentence he had written and understood that it was good. It was the same expression he had worn when he first read poetry and understood why poetry existed. It was the same expression he wore when he looked at her, when he looked at their children, when he stood at the edge of the land they owned and watched the morning light come across the grass. It was the expression of a man who understood that he was alive in the world and that the world was real and that he was part of it in a way that was permanent and worth having been. The book was called Open Land, which was the only title Cole had ever considered for it, and it was dedicated to Eleanor in 2 lines, as simply and precisely as he did everything. To EMW, who gave me the words for what I already knew. She read the dedication standing at the kitchen table in the March morning, and whatever she felt in that moment was the full accumulation of everything she had come to Caldwell Crossing to find and had found in ways she could not have predicted and would not have changed. "You did not have to do that," she said. "Yes, I did," he said. "It is the most accurate thing in the book." The spring of 1886 was when Caldwell Crossing held its annual town social, and the social that year was larger than any previous one, because it had grown into a proper occasion with the addition of a potluck supper, and a gathering of families from 3 of the surrounding townships who had come in part for the social, and in part because word had spread about the school and several families were considering moving to the area partly on the strength of it. Eleanor attended the social with Clara Me in a basket and George on her hip and Cole beside her, and she moved through the gathered crowd of people she had come to know as her own community, greeting the parents of her students, and meeting the new families with the combination of warmth and practicality that had become her signature, asking questions and listening to the answers, and making it clear without any explicit statement that she was interested and that they were welcome. Cole stood beside her through all of it, adding his own quiet comments to conversations when he had something precise to say, and she saw how people responded to him, with a respect that had always been there but had acquired a new dimension since the news of the book had spread through the town, a slight expansion of the already considerable regard they had for a man who was known as reliable and honest and good with horses and land. Mayor Pratt, who was redder in the face and rounder in the coat than he had been when Eleanor arrived, found them at the social and pumped Cole's hand about the book with a proprietary pride that was only slightly diminished by the fact that he had not read it yet, and said to Eleanor, "I always knew you were exactly what we needed," with the conviction of a man rewriting his own history in real time, and Eleanor smiled and said, "I am glad I came," which was true in a way that encompassed everything. That evening, after the children were asleep in the loft, and the house was quiet, and the late spring dark was full of insects outside the open window, Cole sat at the kitchen table writing in a new journal, and Eleanor sat across from him, grading the spring term examinations. And the lamp was warm between them, and the house smelled of beeswax and wood smoke, and something faintly floral from the garden beginning to come in through the window. And Eleanor looked up from her papers and watched him write and thought about a Tuesday morning in March of 1882, and a letter from a man with cramped, urgent handwriting, and a stack of primers falling in the dirt outside a livery stable, and a dark-eyed man who had caught them without ceremony and said no harm, as though it were the simplest thing in the world. "What are you working on?" she asked. He looked up from the journal. "The next book," he said. "I think." She looked at him across the warm lamplight and smiled the full, direct smile that was her own equivalent of his rare laugh, the one she reserved for the things that were completely and exactly right, and said, "Tell me about it." He turned the journal so she could see the first page, and she leaned across the table and read the opening line, and it was good, genuinely and immediately and unmistakably good, and she said so, and he said that he was glad, and they sat together in the lamplight of their house on the eastern edge of Caldwell Crossing, Kansas, in the spring of 1886, and the world was large and real around them, and they were home in it, completely together. In the way that people are home when they have found what they were looking for, and have had the sense to recognize it when it arrived. George knocked something over in the loft above them, the soft thump of a small person redistributing in sleep, and they both looked up at the ceiling for a moment with the shared parental attention that always accompanies such sounds. And when nothing further happened, Cole looked back at his journal, and Eleanor looked back at her papers, and the lamp burned steadily between them, and the night went on in the large, quiet, beautiful way of nights in Kansas, enormous and unhurried, full of stars. There were 47 children in the Caldwell Crossing School the following autumn, and a second classroom built by the men of the town over the summer, and Clara Simmons teaching the lower grades with a confidence she had grown into and wore naturally now, and a wall map on which the children traced the lines of states with their fingers and argued about where they would go when they were grown. There was a lending library of over 80 books, including 6 copies of a volume called Open Land by C.A. Whitaker, which circulated more often than anything else on the shelf except Tom Sawyer, and Pete Harmon, who was 18 and had published 7 pieces in the Dodge City newspaper and 1 in a Kansas City journal, came to Eleanor that September and told her he was going to Topeka in the spring to try for a position on a proper newspaper, and she told him he should go and that he was ready, and that she expected to read his work for the rest of her life. And he stood in the doorway of the schoolhouse in the September afternoon looking at her with the expression of a person who understands what they owe and cannot fully say it, and she said, "Go on," and he went. Ruth Calloway came to supper every Sunday. She sat at the head of the table that Eleanor had suggested she take because it was the position of honor in their house and she had earned it, and she ate and talked and laughed in a way that she did not laugh alone at her house on the 40 acres, and George and Clara regarded her as something between a grandmother and a permanent weather feature, equally essential and equally constant. The land was theirs. The house was warm. The children were growing into themselves with the purposeful curiosity that Eleanor had always believed was the natural state of children given the right conditions. And Cole sat in the evenings with his journal or his books, or with George on his knee listening to him explain some complicated theory about horses that George had developed from observation. And Eleanor watched him and thought about learning. About how it was not a thing that ended when you left a classroom or crossed a certain age or arrived at a certain point of achievement, but went on and on, deepening and widening, for as long as you were paying attention. And Cole Whitaker had been paying attention his whole life, only. Now he had the words for what he saw, and the words were good, and the world was large enough to hold all of them. She had come to the frontier to teach children. She had not stopped teaching and never would, not while there was a child in this town who needed what she had to give. But she had also, entirely without planning it, found a student who had learned from her in ways she had not expected to be able to teach, and who had taught her in return things she had not known she needed to learn, about patience and land, and the dignity of silence, and the courage of a man who keeps reaching for the next thing even when no one has told him it is available to him. The prairie was enormous and beautiful, and full of wind and stars, and the smell of sage, and the sound of horses, and the voices of children learning the shapes of the world. Eleanor Whitaker stood on the porch of her house in the October evening of 1886 and looked out at all of it, at the long gold grass and the enormous sky and the yellow cottonwoods along the creek, and she heard behind her the sound of Cole reading, aloud to George and Clara his quiet voice moving through the pages of a story, unhurried and complete, and she felt the particular peace of a person who has arrived exactly where they were going, who has found the thing they were looking for and made a life of it, who has loved and been loved in return by someone who sees them fully and keeps choosing to look. She stood there for a long time. Then she went inside, and the door closed behind her, and the lamplight was warm, and the story went on.